Robin, you talked a little bit about how you built up the will. One of the questions I know the audience has is about the role of the sponsor. Doug, can you talk a little bit about the role of the sponsor, as well as how authorizing happens in Missouri in general, just to make sure folks understand the roles?
So in Missouri, there's only one authorizer. The authorizer is the State Board of Education. By statute, the authorizer, Missouri State Board of Education, gives the authority for monitoring and oversight to sponsors. The sponsors in Missouri have been institutions of higher education, the local school district in St. Louis or Kansas City, or also could be the Department of Education. Those were the options. And so there has been, for years, a lot of pressure on the universities to sponsor charter schools. Universities in Missouri were introduced to charter schools with their arm twisted behind their back, saying, you want that new arts building? This is what you're going to do. And so it was not a kumbaya, welcome to Missouri, opening to charter schools. The role of the sponsor, providing monitoring and oversight, was something that they had been told. But in universities where you have 1.5 FTE assigned to charter schools, and they're also working in the provost's office on multiple other projects, and there's pressure to put money into monitoring and oversight of charter schools. In Missouri, 1.5% of the per pupil goes to the sponsors. The first years there was no money for sponsors, and the universities were expected to come up with this while they were cutting their English department budgets. There was just a long period of time where universities were not able to provide that monitoring and that oversight. And it just got out in front of them. It got out in front of them that all of a sudden we had all of these different issues happening, and then the pressure was on the universities to provide that monitoring, provide the oversight, and it was too late in many respects.
So give the equivalent of what a sponsor would be like in other cities. How does the sponsor connect to the authorizing?
The sponsor is responsible for approving charter schools that are going to be allowed to open for their term. They're responsible for making decisions around renewal, probation, or closure. And then they're responsible for ensuring to the Department of Education and the State Board that the school is in compliance, meeting all state and federal requirements. The only responsibility in Missouri that the State Board of Education has as the authorizer is when an application is approved, is making sure that it is in compliance with state and federal law. And so the sponsor really has full authority that an authorizer in another state would have.
Okay, great. So we're going to shift to Deb now. There was I guess, a closure in Kansas City that happened prior to this. Tell us a little bit about that and the role the sponsor played there. Thanks, Deb.
I will, and I think it's important to note that since we were young and came into this in 2007, NACSA had identified the state of Missouri, had come in. We were working on a set of model documents. Doug, in his role at that time, came in and worked with our university on what sponsoring authorizing was all about. And that was huge for us, starting off new, and it gave us a roadmap on where to go. This school in Kansas City that we were asked to take on had a long history in the state. We can save that for later. But it was 1,100 students in a K-12 environment, 2 campuses. In 2007, 2008, starting with 1 full-time FTE split between 2 exceptional educators in Kansas City, we immediately knew there were problems in this school. And the 3rd year of that charter, we put the school on probation for academic deficiencies, for governance issues, and for fiscal, just how that was being monitored. When the school was put on probation, this was the first board-directed closure in the state of Missouri. And I was very concerned about the time frame. We knew right from the beginning there were governance issues. We immediately started working on developing relationships with that board and on board education. And that proved to be crucial because when the school was placed on probation, it triggered 3 things. First of all, in our report, we insisted that the renewal application come solely from the board of directors of that school. Secondly, we asked that the board actually sit down and provide us with written documentation that they had reviewed and understood that operating agreement. And then third, we asked the renewal come in the 4th year of the charter rather than the 5th year at the end of the term. The board then took it upon themselves to review their situation, and they voted to not renew that charter. That placed us then a year ahead of time in the position where we were ready to step in and we were ready to plan that transition, develop closure guide and procedures. It was different than what happened on the St. Louis side, but it was still incredibly involved, and it was a bold step for that board to do that. So we were with them every step of the way in processing that. The school closed the same end of the year, same time the schools did in St. Louis. We are still working with closure issues. I consider that school still a part of our portfolio. Been dealing with phone calls yesterday and today on issues related to the closing still. So a different methodology, perhaps a different process, but it really influenced then, I feel, what happened in St. Louis because we had it on both sides of the state. It was going on in both sides of the state.
Great, thanks, Deb. So now let's jump into actually what happened. Once you make the decision to close, Gwen, you came in and actually managed the transition. So tell us what the transition looked like. Where did you start and where are you even today?
And I have how much time?
Oh, 3 minutes.
Okay.
Exactly.
The Department of Elementary and Secondary Education was not in the business of sponsoring charter schools, let alone in the business of closing 6 at one time. So they really did not have a clue, which means I really did not have a clue when I said yes to this whole thing. And there is so much involved. But the important thing was that, and it's been referenced several times now, the groundwork had been laid. So people knew, they understood that this was probably going to happen. Although when it does happen, it's unsettling. It's unsettling for the community. It's completely devastating to some of those families who had 2, 3, maybe 4 children in those schools and wondering, now what do I do? So there are a lot, in addition to all of the things that needed to take place, there's behind it all this emotion as well. When I would walk into any one of those schools, and I was there on a daily basis, I had to face teachers who I knew at the end of the year may not have another job. And I would receive all kinds of phone calls from parents just panicking about, well, now what? Certainly, I don't want my child to go to St. Louis public schools. That's pretty much the reason they had them in a charter school anyway. What are my choices? So one of the things that we had already pre-planned was having enrollment fairs for the students and their families. And at these enrollment fairs, we invited anybody and everybody who was willing to accept any of these displaced students for the upcoming school year. So we had St. Louis Public Schools, of course, represented. We had lots of charter schools within the city of St. Louis represented. We had parochial schools. We had private schools. In most cases, and we had 3 different fairs for the parents to come and kind of shop for a school that they felt would be suitable for their child for the upcoming year, since their other school was closing down. And the participants at those fairs numbered close to 50 in most cases. So there were a lot of options out there, but still, needless to say, not every parent could make it to those enrollment fairs. So that was a real concern throughout the whole process. And there was no real concrete way to tell whether where a student had actually enrolled. In fact, that's the piece of this whole closure process that we're still working on. We're pretty sure that we know where probably 99% of the students are, but we haven't actually been able to match. We have a list of the students who were enrolled in those schools at the end of the school year, and now we're trying to, one by one, make sure we know where every student is. And that is still something that we are continuing to work on. But overall, the closure process went really smoothly only because everybody worked together. And that everybody did include the management corporation over the schools. They were very cooperative in helping to host the enrollment fairs and employment fairs. And we had several meetings with the corporation's staff going over closure processes, because you're talking about closing out federal programs accounts, and you're talking about what about the personnel records, and what about the contracts for the teachers? Do they know what's going on? There are just all kinds of things that really they had to take care of. And when asked, they did. Of course, the Charter School Association, the mayor's office, Deb was very helpful because she already had the experience of closing down a school, but really we had no blueprint for this kind of massive closure. And we all worked together in order to make it go smoothly and successfully.
Gwen, can I just ask you to give a comment around what you do with teachers, if anything? Because you mentioned 400 teachers.
Yes, and we also had employment fairs for the teachers, so that any school districts who did have vacancies for the upcoming school year would have an opportunity to interview them, hire them on the spot, or at least consider them for future reference if they did have some openings.
Got it. One of the things that I read, and Rob and I talked about this earlier, is that almost 80%, I believe, of the kids actually did return back to the traditional public school. And so the superintendent definitely did have a role in this. Can you share a little bit about what that role was, and even where there was opportunity to really make sure the transition happened more smoothly for parents and students?
Absolutely. I really can't give Gwen enough credit for the work that she and the department did in helping transition the families. But even so, I think there were some missed opportunities. We started, much as we were talking with the press and the business community, I met with the superintendent of the St. Louis Public Schools on several occasions, giving him a heads up that we were headed in this direction. Again, it was part of our overall strategy of really reinforcing our interest in quality. But I don't think he believed us. And actually, if he was sitting here today, he would have told you that he would not have bet that this could have really been pulled off. But our request to him was to begin looking at schools that were in the general vicinity of the 6, these were Imagine schools, throughout the city, and look at where there were schools that had high performance or much better performance. Because we really believe that the children were missing opportunities today. Even if these schools existed, we would have wanted those families to transfer into better performing schools. He did not seize that opportunity. And I think that in the end, when the closures actually were announced, the district was prepared to take the students on structurally. They knew that they had enrollment fairs, and they certainly participated and provided a great deal of information to parents. But it really was, it wasn't funneling children into these better performing schools. In fact, in the end, they retained one of the locations that was a former Imagine school put the same name on the building, but just St. Louis Public Schools on it, and are educating the children with some of the same teachers and some of the same school leaders. And so I'm not sure we're really going to see much difference in the end about this. And so for me, it wasn't just getting rid of poor performing schools. That is the promise, performance or close. But it was really ultimately, are children in better schools, or do they have a chance at higher academic performance? And I'm not sure we realize that.